You're watching News in Depth on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. Romania sits along Europe's eastern flank and borders the war-torn country of Ukraine. And just last month, it made headlines. News that Washington was pulling troops out of the country sent shivers down the spines of some allies, while others, like Romania's own Foreign Minister Oana Țsoiu, told me she wasn't celebrating the decision, but she respects it. That means the stakes were high this week when NATO forces descended on Romania to train and prepare for a possible Russian attack. Our correspondent Alex Cadier was there and is now back in Brussels, which hosts NATO HQ, from where he joins me now. Good afternoon, Alex.
Good afternoon, Aaron.
So tell me, Alex, another NATO exercise, another drill. What was it about this one that made it worth you heading out to Romania for?
Well, certainly the scale of it was a big difference. That was the emphasis made by so many military officials I spoke to. They said it was bigger and they thought better than the same drill in the past. And of course, that is a notable feature of this exercise Station 4, as they called it. This is an annual drill. They have done this before. They did it last year in Romania as well, and it is meant to simulate an attack from someone. They were quite coy about naming a particular adversary on the Romanian territory. So an attack on Romania, what would a NATO response look like? But of course, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in more depth, it was also in the context of the US, as you just mentioned, removing some of its troops that were permanently positioned in Romania and repurposing them elsewhere. There is a broader discussion, a broader concern, a broader worry about the US reducing its force posture on the eastern flank of Europe. And we've heard those messages from Marco Rubio, from Pete Hegseth, saying very clearly it is not for the US to be the insurance policy when it comes to security in Europe anymore. They want to see Europeans stepping up. That's why, particularly interesting, the French military had such a presence in this exercise, was leading this exercise, and also had more kit this year than they did last year.
It's interesting you say about not calling, a spade, not calling Russia, because when I was in Finland, there was the same experience. Officials would say, oh, we have a neighbour. They would say we're preparing for a threat, but they would never say we're preparing for a Russian attack. Why do you think that is? What sense did you get why they're not willing to say, hey, look, we're preparing for a potential Russian incursion?
Well, I think the deterrence is there anyways. That's what military officials were saying. The point of these exercises is to show that European nations can respond in a coordinated manner to any threat on NATO's eastern flank. But behind the scenes, nobody is particularly coy about what this is about, because the threat in the region is further Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, possibly in Central Europe. I put that question. I was pushing French generals to answer more directly. And I said, look, I don't know why we're being coy. This is about Russia. And they responded quite formally, well, no, this is about any threat, and we are preparing, as NATO being a defensive alliance, for any attack on the eastern flank. And I perhaps a bit cheekily pushed those French generals. I said, yes, but it's not, Moldova is not going to be invading Romania anytime soon. They said quite bluntly, yes, but Moldova can be crossed by an external power. We know that pro-Russian separatists are still controlling the Moldovan region of Transnistria. So clearly the threat on the eastern flank of Europe, but particularly with Romania, is clearly Russian aggression. Behind the scenes, they're very clear about that. Publicly, I think there is a desire to avoid any inflammatory statements, any escalation, or any statements that could be seized upon by Russian propagandists over in Moscow.
Now, there have been several officials, including Secretary General Mark Rutte, downplaying this withdrawal of an American infantry brigade. What did you get a sense of on the ground? Was there a sense that Washington is sending an emboldening message somewhat to Vladimir Putin?
Well, it was the same downplaying on the ground as well. Military officials from France, from other nations, as well as NATO officials I was speaking to, were saying, look, this is a primarily European exercise. It's led by the French. It was led by the French last year. The American presence was very limited, it has to be said. They had some operators there helping with the coordination, the organization of the exercise. There were some American forces there visible. They were not, however, taking part in the exercise itself. Now, for Station 4, that's not necessarily a sign of something dramatic, because, as the officials said on the ground, this was primarily to test a European coordinated response, including how quickly you can get European forces to Eastern Europe. All of those things really the focus of this exercise was that commitment. But again, some informal discussions with those officials say that, of course, Europe has to step up, has to beef up defences. We've seen that with Germany absolutely massively raising its ability to borrow, to be able to spend on defence. We've seen increased budgets committed at the NATO summit back in The Hague a couple months ago. So clearly there is a realisation in Europe that they have to step up. There's also a sense behind the scenes that the US position has shifted or has softened a little bit when it comes to this. Maybe if there were, God forbid, to be a war in Central and Eastern Europe, if there were to be another Russian aggression in Europe, there may not be a massive troop deployment from the United States or American tanks charging towards St. Petersburg, but there would still be support from the US when it comes to intelligence, when it comes to logistics, the things that the US can do better or can only do rather relative to those European forces. So there's a bit of a mix. There's a bit of, downplaying the risk. There are some who are concerned, particularly because these European militaries, there's a lot they can't do without the US, but they're working to build up those capacities.
You raise a really interesting point there, talking about, for example, intelligence sharing. I mean, what about America's position on those security guarantees? Did officials raise concerns about how or when NATO's Article 5, this clause that says an attack on one is an attack on all, could be invoked? And crucially, because this is what a lot of people talk about, whether or not Donald Trump can be trusted to help.
Yeah, that's a big question, and frankly speaking, not one that European officials or NATO officials had a very clear answer on, because Article 5, that collective defence, an attack on one is an attack on all, that is the backbone of NATO. If it is triggered, of course, it'll be triggered by an ally. The only time it was triggered, the only time that the NATO alliance responded was after 9/11, when the United States asked for help from its NATO allies because it considered that an attack on its national security and on its country. So the real question is, what could an aggression from Russia look like? What could a conflict with Russia look like? What triggers Article 5? Again, senior military leadership I was speaking to in the last few days are very skeptical that we're going to see a Ukraine-style invasion in Europe, particularly because an invasion of that scale, of that size, with large troop numbers, with tanks building up on Europe's borders, would be spotted incredibly quickly, and then Europe would be able to build up in response on its side of the border in preparation for any conflict. So that brings the question of, would, for example, a massive cyber attack on, let's say, German public health systems be considered an attack worth triggering Article 5? Would a drone incursion in Copenhagen shutting down the airport? Clearly, that did not count in the eyes of the Danish government as an Article 5 worthy attack. It was seen as hybrid warfare. And that, of course, is what a lot of these NATO officials are saying, is that if there is an aggression from Russia, it may not look like the big whopping invasion of the kind of Second World War style military build-up, but it may be a slow incremental build-up of hybrid attacks, be it on critical infrastructure, with drone incursions, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns. The big question is whether or not that is enough for Europeans to say we're under attack and we need help, and whether or not the US will see it as a worthy cause to come and help Europe.
And those red lines, an absolute open discussion, I think, at the moment. Let's talk about this drill, these exercises that you've been to this week, because there's this NATO buzzword of military mobility. I mean, a big part of any alliance-wide response to the Kremlin will be getting troops or literal equipment to the front line, right? So you spoke to a couple of generals. I want to play those clips out now. Let's take a listen.
The thing that slowed us down was the deployment of our brigades. As we're in peacetime, our journey was slowed by administrative procedures because our military trains did not get priority to cross borders, so they waited 1 or 2 days. What we'd like is a kind of military Schengen, the capacity to deploy at all times in all European countries. It is a real need to put in place the defensive plans we have.
So how big a part was this discussion around military mobility and this idea of military Schengen? I mean, any more details on what that could look like?
Well, military Schengen is exactly what it says on the tin. So it's the idea, like, I travelled through Germany to Romania from Belgium to get to this exercise, and I did not have to show my passport to a border officer at any point, because Schengen allows the free movement of people military Schengen would allow the free movement of military forces, of military equipment. For now, as you just heard from General Maxime Dautrand, the French general in charge of basically just getting all the kit where it needed to be from France all the way to Romania, is that there are still delays, still paperwork delays when it comes to getting military equipment across borders, even if it's just in transit, because they need paperwork, they need customs forms, they need to do all of the red tape because there is no military Schengen. Now, these military leaders, the General Louis, who you just heard, who's the commander of the 1st French Army, said that there is a need to be able to deploy more permanently, to be much more mobile for these militaries, to show that Europe can move very quickly at all times, even in peacetime. Both those generals also understood that if there's a passenger train of 250 people, they would be quite frustrated if their train is held for 2-3 hours to allow tanks to roll through who are just going to an exercise in peacetime. So there's a bit of a political balance, and I'm sure we'll come back to the politics of this in a moment. But both generals actually quite confident in the fact that in wartime, if Article 5 is triggered, it would go much, much faster. Another interesting detail in the planning of this exercise that General Dautrand from France shared with us is that actually for a lot of the equipment, they took a ship from the southern ports of France and sailed across the Mediterranean to Greece, which reduces, of course, the number of borders you have to go through. Then it's Greece, Bulgaria, and into Romania for the exercise, and that was in under 10 days. Now, again, 10 days, give or take, is about twice as long as they think this equipment could travel across Europe if there was no friction at all. Another really interesting example from General Louis, the senior 1st Army general, who you just heard from there, he gave a counterexample to say that actually there is actually a way for these militaries to get through Europe very quickly. He gave the example of the start of Russia's full-scale invasion back in February 2022. French forces were called to deploy to the Romanian border to make sure that Europe was secure when all of that was happening in neighboring Ukraine. He explained a situation where French forces were crossing the border into Italy. They had Italian police officers waiting for them who escorted them on blue lights through the country to get to the next border. So he shows that when there is a military emergency, when there is a security risk to Europe, these issues of paperwork and friction can be tossed to the side. But of course, there is still a big problem about military mobility, because at the moment, the comfort of civilian life, of peacetime, takes priority over military drills.
And of course, there's nowhere that Russia's threats are being felt more than in Ukraine. I mean, did you see evidence of NATO, I guess, drawing lessons from the war and even adapting some of its kit?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly saw some adaptation. You saw FPV drones, those kind of quadricopter small drones being flown. Now, I have to say they were quite a sideshow. They kind of flew around and there was narration about these are FPV drones, and they're very, very similar to the drones that I've seen that we reported on in Ukraine. And they showed a drone hitting a target, which is effectively a sheet hanging from a frame, and the drone hit that, and that was basically it. We also saw what they called a VAB Arlad. I'll break that down. It's effectively an older French armoured vehicle, which usually has a 50 caliber machine gun on the top. That's been changed. They now have a grenade launcher, which is operated automatically from inside the armoured vehicle. And the grenade launcher is designed to shoot drones out of the sky. The issue with the VAB Arlad in particular, which the crew itself told me about, number one, they're not training a lot on it, and it was only brought out a few months ago, so it is still very new as a kind of piece of kit. But also, if you're trying to hit an FPV drone that's travelling at 180 kilometers an hour, and you're using a joystick and an automated turret to do so, it's quite hard to hit your target. And the final point is that the VAB Arlad can only fire if it is stationary. So again, there is clearly, these militaries are adapting some of their systems to prepare for more active countermeasures for FPV drones, but some of the equipment not quite there yet. Having said that, a big caveat to this, I would say, Aaron, is that if European NATO allies and these allies trying to deter Russia have incredibly effective brand new technology that hasn't been made public yet, I'm not sure they would reveal it at a press tour full of cameras. So there is also a possibility that there is new technology being developed. We know that, of course, NATO takes the drone threat very seriously indeed. It may just not be made public for quite understandable security reasons. And a quick final point on drones, because obviously we're talking about different types of drones here. FPV drones, those small quadricopters which in Ukraine are used either as surveillance or reconnaissance drones or as kamikaze drones. They have an explosive charge on them and they fly into people or into weaponry. There was also a question that I put to the generals about shaheds, long-range drones, the kind of drones that you see 500 at a time in their hundreds flying into Ukraine, targeting energy infrastructure, cities, etc., as we've seen in Ukraine in the last 24 hours. We put the question that European countries don't yet have an answer to these swarms of drones coming into cities and possibly hitting residential buildings and civilians. The response off camera from the generals was very interesting. They said that is slightly missing the point because NATO is not Ukraine. They have far more developed capabilities, much more power, they have weaponry that packs a much more serious punch, and therefore the response from NATO would not just be shooting drones. In fact, there would be an offensive response, a defensive response effectively, if there were an attack on the alliance. And so the generals were effectively saying, we're much stronger than just needing to shoot drones down because they have the capacity to hit any adversary further down the supply chain.
We're running out of time, but while I have you, you've spent quite some time over recent months in Kyiv. Defence ministers met in Berlin today to talk about support for Ukraine. Germany has pledged 150 million euros in US arms via the NATO mechanism. I mean, talk to me about how these meetings are viewed by Ukrainians. On the ground, is it viewed as productive or is it often viewed as procrastinating?
Meetings for meetings' sake, I think, would be the response from most Ukrainians because they have a sense of complete and total urgency at all times because the threat across the countries, even as far west as Lviv, is present. These Russian missiles flying in, Russian drones flying in, buildings being destroyed, children having to go to school underground, medical facilities also being hit by these attacks. To then see defence ministers getting together once again, like they do here in Brussels, either at the EU or NATO, saying we stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, particularly for soldiers, will either be broadly ignored or a sense of real frustration because they do not see a decisive moment of support, a decisive change from European powers. If we put that to one side for a second, that Ukrainian frustration, what will also be interesting at the political level, and this is what the military leadership in Romania told me, is that they need politicians to make a decision. Are we in peacetime? Are we in wartime? The German chancellor saying that Europe is not at peace with Russia, but not at war with Russia. That creates an ambiguity. Let's go back concretely. What does that mean in practice? Those trains, do military trains get priority now for drills, or do civilian trains still get priority? Do we clear the roads for military equipment? Do we not? What is the balance between the comfort of peacetime and the necessity of wartime? Aaron.
And we've seen leaders consistently, more and more, talk about that difference between peace but not war and the gap in between. Alex Cadier in Brussels, thank you so much for your time. And that is your news in depth tonight here on TVP World. Do stay with us. I'm Aaron Darman. Goodbye for now.